the most wicked man. This nickname echoed through the ages, whispered in temples, in the corridors of secret societies, and later splashed across sensational headlines. But who was truly capable of evoking such repulsion and fascination? To grasp the magnitude of this figure, we must shed our theological preconceptions and delve into the depths of a universe that defies linear understanding of reality. Aleister Crowley, the self-proclaimed the Great Beast 666, was no mere man. He was a catalyst, a flame-bringer who sought to ignite slumbering minds, to unveil the veils that hide the mysteries of the cosmos and the human psyche. This itinerary is neither a eulogy nor a condemnation. It is an invitation to explore the origins of a distorted perception, forged in the furnace of ignorance and fear of the unknown. The narrative that follows is guided by a singular perspective, that of Crowley himself, not as a villain, but as a bold explorer of realms that conventional morality denies. He saw himself as a prophet, a missionary of the true self, a master of unlocking the codes of existence through magic, alchemy, and a profound understanding of human psychology. His journey, marked by controversy and accusations of nefarious practices, is in fact the journey of someone who dared to tread paths that most fear to even glimpse. Why then has this figure become synonymous with perversion? The answer lies in the very nature of what he sought and the tools he wielded. The power of indomitable will, the quest for gnosis, supreme knowledge, and the rediscovery of ancient esoteric traditions, which the Church in its ascendancy strove to suppress. Christianity, in its orthodoxy, has always viewed with suspicion anything that escaped its dogma. Magic, astrology, and contemplative practices that didn't fit into their rites were all relegated to the realm of the profane and the demonic. Crowley, with his sharp intelligence and rebellious spirit, embraced precisely these fields, not to corrupt, but to understand. He believed that the forces the religious world called demons were, in fact, aspects of consciousness itself, powerful archetypes to be mastered and integrated, not feared. His infamous nickname, the most wicked man, was not a title he aspired to, but rather a reflection of the outside world's inability to understand his quest for spiritual freedom and the fulfillment of latent human potential. Throughout this exploration, we will unravel the symbols he manipulated, the rituals he performed, and the secret orders he founded or participated in. This is not a mere historical curiosity, but a delve into the subterranean currents that shaped Western thought and that continue to influence, in often subtle ways, our perception of reality, ourselves and the universe. Prepare to question everything you thought you knew about good and evil, about spirituality and the human psyche. For in this universe, shadows reveal more truths than the blinding light. Aleister Crowley's journey is the journey of a man who dared to be truly free. And that freedom, for many, was the most dangerous manifestation of all. The genesis of Crowley's wicked moniker lies not only in his esoteric practices, but in the way he challenged prevailing religious and moral structures. He saw Christianity, in particular, as a system of control that imprisoned true human nature, a repression of the life force and free will in favor of blind submission. In his seminal work, The Book of the Law, transmitted to him by an entity he called I Was, one of the pillars is the maxim, "Do what thou wilt, for that is the whole of the law." This is not a license for unrestrained hedonism, as is often misinterpreted, but rather a call to discover and realize the true self. Crowley understood that will here refers to the essential will, the divine calling of each individual, a driving force that, when fully understood and directed, leads to self-realization and union with the divine. Christian society, on the other hand, promoted a radical dualistic vision, separating body from soul, pleasure from morality, and labeling as sin any manifestation that escaped this dichotomy. For Crowley, this dichotomy was artificial and harmful, an invention to keep the masses in a state of fear and dependence. He, on the other hand, sought the integration of all aspects of existence, the cosmic dance between light and shadow, the spiritual and the carnal. Alchemy, for example, was not simply the transmutation of metals into gold, but an analogous process of spiritual transmutation, the purification of the soul through the manipulation of primordial forces. The philosopher's stone was, in his view, gnosis, the knowledge that frees the individual from the chains of ignorance and dogma. Thus the perverse practices attributed to him, such as ritualistic self-mutilation, drug use, or exploratory sexuality were, in his view, tools for expanding consciousness, breaking through self-imposed limits, and exploring the recesses of the human psyche, where he believed the divine spark resided. He sought not evil for its own sake, but the understanding that evil, like good, is a human construct, and that true power lies in transcending this duality, in embracing the totality of experience. His insistence on individual autonomy and the pursuit of direct, personal knowledge without ecclesiastical intermediaries posed an existential threat to an institution that thrived on dependence and dogmatic authority. Therefore, the religious and media propaganda machine of the time came together to paint him as the epitome of depravity, a figure to be feared and avoided at all costs, thus silencing the voice of a thinker who dared to question the foundations of social control. Crowley's profound understanding of evil lies in his exploration of secret orders and mystical societies. He saw these organizations not as mere clubs of occult enthusiasts, but as living laboratories for experimentation and the application of will. The Golden Dawn, one of the most influential Hermetic orders of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was where Crowley received much of his formal training in ceremonial magic. There, he learned the language of symbols, the mechanics of rituals, and the hierarchy of spiritual forces that he would later reconfigure and reinterpret. However, his dissatisfaction with the limitations imposed by the order's structure, coupled with his growing convictions about the need for a new spiritual dispensation, led him to seek independent paths. He believed that the Golden Dawn, despite its knowledge, had become complacent, losing the urgency and vitality of the Gnostic quest. He subsequently founded his own organization, the Astrum Argenteum, AA, the Order of the Silver Cross, with the goal of disseminating the knowledge of the Book of the Law. Later came Thelema, not just as a philosophy, but as a complete magical and religious system, with its own cosmology, ethics, and rituals. The very nature of these orders, operating in the shadows of society, fueled the perception that something evil and secret was afoot. For those operating within established dogma, any knowledge or practice operating outside the public eye was, by definition, suspect and therefore evil. Crowley, however, argued that certain esoteric truths were of such a nature that their indiscriminate revelation could be dangerous to those unprepared. Thus, the secret orders served not only as a means of preserving and transmitting knowledge, but also as a filter, ensuring that only the truly dedicated and capable individuals could ascend to the deepest levels of understanding. He saw discretion not as a sign of evil, but as a necessity intrinsic to the very nature of magic. Consider, for example, the concept of ceremonial magic, that Crowley practiced. It was not trivial incantations and superstitions, but meticulous psychological and spiritual work, using precise gestures, invocations in ancient languages, such as Hebrew and Egyptian, elaborate visualizations, and the use of symbolically charged ritual tools, such as the wand, the chalice, the blade, and the pentacle. The magician aimed to alter consciousness and, consequently, reality. For Crowley, the universe was not a static, physical mechanism, but a dynamic field of subtle energies, which could be influenced by the force of concentrated and directed will through magical methods. The perversity the world saw resided in large part in the misinterpretation of these practices. When Crowley spoke of summoning demons, he wasn't necessarily referring to malevolent entities in the popular sense, but rather to psychic archetypes, primordial energies within the human unconscious that needed to be confronted, understood, and integrated. The goal was self-transformation, the great work of inner alchemy, where the individual becomes their own master, freed from the limitations of the egoic personality and united with their higher self, their divine spark. The alleged moral transgressions associated with it were, in his view, simply the dismantling of obsolete social taboos that prevented the full exploration of human nature, which he saw as intrinsically divine. Despite its dark manifestations, the complexity of these rituals and the depth of their symbolism were, to the outside and uninitiated observer, fertile ground for speculation and accusations, cementing his image as the most wicked man who dared to explore the limits of human permissiveness. True evil, from Crowley's perspective, lay in the alienation of human beings from their own divine nature, a process subtly orchestrated by belief systems that fostered guilt and the denial of one's deepest instincts. He, on the other hand, saw the need to reintegrate what had been fragmented, to accept and work with the totality of the psyche, including that which society labeled dark or forbidden. This manifested itself in psychological alchemy, a central concept in his system, which went far beyond the mere manipulation of symbols or the performance of external rituals. For Crowley, the great work of alchemy was, above all, an inner journey, the transmutation of lead, the limited ego, ordinary consciousness, into gold, illuminated consciousness. The manifested divine self was an active process, requiring the confrontation and purification of one's own imperfections, fears, and repressed desires. It was a dive into the depths of the unconscious, where personal demons resided, not external entities, but projections of our own shadows, fears and destructive impulses that, if ignored or repressed, gained power and manifested in destructive ways. Gnostic practice, the search for direct, experiential knowledge of spiritual truths, was key to this process. Crowley did not preach blind faith, but rather the rigorous and personal investigation of truth. He encouraged his followers to experiment, to test esoteric truths for themselves, to discover the workings of the mind and the universe through direct practice, not through passive acceptance of dogma. This approach, while aimed at liberation and self-transformation, was seen by its opponents as an invitation to moral disorder and spiritual anarchy. If each individual was the arbiter of their own truth, what prevented complete decadence? This was the question that echoed, and Crowley's answer was will itself. When aligned with the true self, the danger, in his view, was not the search for truth, but its denial, the imprisonment in limiting thought structures that impeded the growth and fulfillment of human potential. He pointed to the hypocrisy inherent in many religious institutions, where external morality often masked a deep internal corruption a testament to the failure to integrate the dark aspects of human nature. Crowley's apparent perversity, therefore, was in essence a radical attempt to restore wholeness, to embrace the totality of human experience, and to awaken the divine potential latent in each individual, freeing them from the chains of an imposed morality and a limited view of reality. Thus, his search for gnosis and the fulfillment of the will was an act of spiritual revolution against a system that, he believed, promoted true perversion, the denial of the intrinsic divinity in every human being, and the suppression of free will in the name of dogmatic control. The social and psychological dimension of perversity associated with Crowley becomes clearer when we examine his critique of sexual repression and puritanical morality. He believed that sexual energy, one of the most potent forces in life, was often misunderstood and terribly repressed in Western societies, especially under the influence of rigid religious dogma. This repression, in his view, did not lead to purity, but rather to neuroses, frustrations, and unhealthy manifestations of this pent-up vital energy. Crowley, influenced by emerging currents of esoteric and psychological thought of his time, saw sexuality as a gateway to mystical experiences and self-knowledge. He did not promote unbridled lust, but rather the understanding and conscious use of sexual energy as a tool for expanding consciousness and spiritual fulfillment, a concept known as sex magic. This practice, in its various forms, involved using sexual arousal and orgasm to focus and direct psychic energy, invoking altered states of consciousness and even communication with entities or aspects of the divine. By the moral standards of the time, and even by many today, this exploration of sexuality in a ritualistic context was inherently shocking and considered profane. The media and moralists of the time, unable to grasp the depth of the symbolism and the goal of self-transformation behind these practices, labeled Crowley a deviant, a manipulator who exploited his followers for lustful purposes. He, on the other hand, argued that liberation from the shackles of repressed sexuality was a crucial step toward true individual freedom and reconnection with the intrinsically divine nature of the human being. In his own words, he sought initiation through ecstasy, where the limits of the ego would dissolve in intense pleasure, allowing a glimpse of cosmic unity. He saw sexuality not as something to be hidden or ashamed, but as a powerful creative and spiritual force, a manifestation of divine love in its most primordial form. His critique of Christian morality, which he saw as a denial of life and a source of psychological suffering, was scathing. He believed that the guilt and fear associated with sexuality created internal barriers that prevented individuals from reaching their full potential. By encouraging the exploration and acceptance of this energy, he sought to dismantle these taboos and promote a healthier, more integrated view of human sexuality. This radically different perspective, which directly challenged the pillars of social and religious morality, was a key reason he was vilified and portrayed as the epitome of perversity. To his detractors, he not only challenged dogma, but also seemed to promote the dissolution of social order and common decency. What they saw as libertinism, Crowley saw as a necessary path to psychological healing and spiritual fulfillment in a world imprisoned by repression. Spread of Crowley's image as the most wicked man also rested on his ability to influence popular culture and public perception through his carefully constructed public persona and his association with controversial figures. Far from being a reclusive hermit, Crowley was a master of personal marketing, utilizing his sharp wit, charisma, and reputation to attract attention and often scandal. He knew that shock and controversy generated interest, and he exploited this to promote his ideas and his philosophy of life, thelema, his personal life, replete with exotic travels, involvement in art, literature, and, of course, the occult arts, provided abundant material for the tabloid press of the time. Articles portrayed him as a satanic sorcerer, a drug dealer, and a leader of depraved cults, often distorting or fabricating events to create a more shocking narrative. This image, though grotesquely inaccurate in many respects, became Crowley's trademark for the general public. He consciously played with this image, embracing the moniker, the Great Beast, cut in 666, a biblical reference with strong negative connotations, as a way to subvert its meaning and transform it into a symbol of liberation and individuality. For him, the beast represented not evil, but rather the primal life force, the indomitable energy of nature and sexuality that had been suppressed by civilization and religion. This calculated ambiguity, the fine line between spiritual teacher and storytelling demon, was a powerful weapon in his battle against ignorance and conformity. Furthermore, Crowley actively sought to integrate his teachings and symbols into various forms of cultural expression. He associated with artists, writers, and musicians, and his ideas began to permeate the artistic and intellectual landscape. Although he was never a rock musician per se, his subsequent influence on subcultures such as psychedelic rock and heavy metal, where occult symbolism and rebellion against the norm were recurring themes, further solidified his image as an icon of transgression. Later bands such as Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and others explored themes and imagery that echoed his philosophy, whether intentionally or not, bridging the gap between his esoteric teachings and mass culture. This cultural projection, fueled by the media and embraced by artistic movements, ultimately cemented in many minds the idea of Crowley as the archetype of the dangerous rebel and the master of darkness, a master of distorting reality for his own nefarious ends. The wickedness attributed to him, therefore, became a social construct, a narrative amplified by the media and popular culture, which transformed a radical explorer of human consciousness into a monster, convenient for keeping the masses in their place and reinforcing established dogma. He became a scarecrow, a convenient puppet for the fears and anxieties of a society that refused to look at its own inner demons. As we weave together the threads of our investigation, we realize that the figure once relegated to ostracism begins to reveal layers of complexity that transcend superficial simplifications. What emerges is not a mere caricature of a transgressor, but the silhouette of a man who dared to navigate waters where the compass of conventional morality often fails. This journey, punctuated by profound explorations of the realms of mind and spirit, invites us to consider how the echoes of these quests resonate beyond convention, shaping, often invisibly, the tapestry of our own understanding. The ideas we uncover, as they merge, create a conceptual force field, a vortex that draws our attention to the depths of self-knowledge and the changing nature of perceived reality. Reflecting on this journey thus far, we observe how ancient wisdoms, once obscured and marginalized, find a point of convergence in an invitation to rediscovery. The structures that govern the perception of reality, both individual and collective, reveal themselves to be more malleable and open to interpretation than commonly assumed. The very notion of transgression, when examined in a new light, can be perceived not as an end in itself, but as a catalyst for the expansion of consciousness. We are thus faced with a panorama where the veil of mystery, once threatening, begins to lift, allowing us to glimpse a horizon where knowledge and direct experience merge. As we approach the conclusion, It is remarkable how the elements discussed converge to a focal point, where notions of power, knowledge, and the very essence of being become inextricably interconnected. The journey through symbols, rituals, and philosophies that once seemed distant now presents itself as a polished mirror, reflecting aspects of our own search for meaning and transcendence. The conceptual landscape we have traced prepares us for a broader understanding, where the boundaries between the known and the unknown become fluid, inviting a perspective that embraces the totality of human experience, with its lights and shadows, its certainties and its deepest questions. The transition to the final reflection occurs at this threshold, a space where the multiple facets of a complex narrative come together, anticipating a conclusion that resonates with the depths of existence itself. As we peel back the layers surrounding Aleister Crowley, the moniker, the most wicked man, reveals itself not as a seal of condemnation, but as a distorted reflection of the profound unrest his quest generated in a world that prizes conformity. What for orthodoxy represented the abyss, for him was the dawn of a new understanding, the gateway to the realization of true will and the integration of the opposites that make up the human experience. His journey, far from being a mere nihilistic whim, was a masterful study of the nature of power, not the power to dominate, but the power to be, to know oneself, and to shape one's reality through the force of consciousness. Alchemy, rituals, thelema itself, all converge toward a single purpose: to unveil the latent divinity within each being, freeing them from the chains of fear, guilt, and imposed ignorance. The perversity attributed to it was not its essence, but the shadow cast by the world's resistance to accepting a radical spiritual freedom, an autonomy of thought that challenged the pillars of dogmatic control. Crowley's true legacy lies not in the controversies that surrounded him, but in the implicit invitation to explore the inner realms, to have the courage to question dogma, and to boldly seek truth in its deepest sources. His life teaches us that the most transformative knowledge often resides beyond the limits of the comfortably known, at the frontiers where reason meets intuition, and where the spiritual intertwines with the instinctual. He challenges us to confront our own shadows, not with terror, but with the wisdom of one who recognizes in them the source of a dormant power, essential elements for the completeness of being. Thus, the figure who was once synonymous with depravity now stands as a beacon, albeit an enigmatic one, guiding those who dare to walk the path of self-discovery. The reverberation of his ideas, filtered by time and culture, remains like a persistent whisper in the human soul, an invitation for each of us to become the master of our own destiny, the alchemist of our own existence. Perversity, after all, may be merely the mask wisdom wears to reveal itself to those ready to embrace their wholeness. Authentic practice, the one that dismantles the veils and ignites the inner flame, begins now. The true quest begins by turning our gaze inward, where the deepest truth awaits discovery, not as a dogma to be accepted, but as an experience to be lived.